Welcome to the Financial Planning for Canadian Business Owners podcast. You will hear about industry insights with award-winning financial planner and entrepreneur Jason Pereira. Through the interviews with different experts with their stories and advice, you will learn how you can navigate the challenges of being an entrepreneur, plan for success, and make the most of your business and life. And now, your host, Jason Pereira.
Hello and welcome. Today on the show, I have Jon Shell. Brought him back to discuss employee ownership trusts again, because now we have some definitive legislation around these and that have addressed many of the issues or concerns we had in the first episode. So hopefully you will enjoy this update. Well, Jon, how's it going?
It's good, Jason. How are you?
Good. Jon, thanks for coming back. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me back.
I will go so far to say, as in a budget that was full of things I despised, this was one thing I loved. Let's talk about employee ownership trusts, which you've been a big player in. And actually, before we start, let's talk about a little bit about who you are and remind people of who you are and what your involvement with this topic is.
Sure. Jon Shell, I'm chair of Social Capital Partners. We are a nonprofit based here in Toronto. Our objective is to find ways for people who don't have access to asset ownership to be able to get asset ownership. All of us here generally have a private sector background. I was a consultant for a while. I bought veterinary practices for a while and been doing this work for about 7 years. Our approach to asset ownership has centered around employee ownership over the last 4 or 5 years. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today.
We are. All right. For those who didn't listen to the previous episode, they should go back. But let's talk about what is an employee ownership trust.
An employee ownership trust is a new structure that has just been added to the Income Tax Act. Its purpose is to facilitate the succession of a privately held business to its employees. And when I say its employees, all of its employees. The trust is a vehicle that owns shares indirectly on behalf of all of a company's employees. And in that way, it has facilitated a lot of transitions to employees in the US and the UK where that model exists. I know we're going to get into detail about how the model works, but in the US and the UK, I should just quickly say there are a lot of majority employee-owned companies, and most of those, the vast majority of them, use a trust model like the employee ownership trust that we now have in Canada. In the UK, there's over 300 companies a year are sold to employee ownership trusts. That's about 5 to 10% of all transactions in the UK. There are now about 2,000 of them. In the US, there are about 7,000 companies owned through their version of the employee ownership trust. Here in Canada, we have very few. There's less than 100, we think, maybe 50 or 60 majority employee-owned companies, but we haven't had this model yet, and we think that's about to change.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about the benefits of this model first and foremost. Pick that back. We're good at this. Okay, so let's start off by talking about from the employer's standpoint, why would they want to sell their business to an employee ownership trust? And of course, this is very new in Canada, so let's talk about specifically through the eyes of what the Canadian legislation says.
So if you're a business owner in Canada of a private company, and we can talk about the types of companies for whom this applies, when you look to sell, and I have been a business owner looking to sell, so this is an issue that I understand a little bit. There aren't a ton of options for you, right? Depending on the size of your company, you could sell to private equity. Depending on your industry, you might be able to sell to a competitor. But there are a lot of business owners who don't want to go either of those routes, right? For reasons that they're worried about their company culture. They've built their company over decades. They care deeply about their employees. They're often in a community where there aren't private equity companies or competitors, so they worry about their head office being moved. A lot of considerations for owners who are looking to sell. And there aren't often people who are from that community, from that industry, with the means to buy their company. So the employee ownership trust acts as another option for succession. It allows an owner to sell their shares to this trust. The trust then owns the shares on behalf of all employees. There's a trustee appointed to govern that trust. And the company continues to be managed the way it always has been. It's not like now it's a co-op and it's one person, one vote and everything goes. If they built a culture and a structure and a business that has stood the test of time, and they think will continue to stand the test of time, and they have a decent management transition in place, they can sell their shares to this trust, and then all of the benefits in the future flow to their employees. Now, the question is obviously, how do I get paid if I'm an owner who does this thing? And the way it works is the owner, so the simplest way to describe it is the business owner lends the money to the company to buy the company from themselves. And so then the company will pay back the owner out of cash flow over time. And once that debt has been repaid, then the company is owned free and clear by the employees. In the US, there is a lot of bank involvement in their version of this. We hope that will be true in Canada too, where a bank will also provide a loan to the trust to buy the shares of the company. And so the owner will be able to get some cash upfront in that scenario.
Yeah, so it's what's known as a vendor take-back, which is not unusual and very common. If we can finance through debt, then absolutely, it's definitely a benefit. But let's talk about, okay, some owners may say that and say, well, hold on a sec, I'm technically the lender here, like I'm basically having the company pay me with the company's money, but I own the company already. So the question becomes, why would they do this? And then there's some very good incentives around taxation baked into this legislation. And you take it.
Yeah, first I'll tell you about the incentives, and then we'll talk about why they exist. So the government has just introduced, alongside the employee ownership trust, a tax incentive where the first $10 million of gain from a sale of a privately held company in Canada to an employee ownership trust will be tax-free. So,
let's just clarify one thing. That is huge, because under the old tax capital gains rates, that was the equivalent savings of $2.5 million. Now it's probably closer to $3.4 million in taxation. So that is enormous compared to the lifetime capital gains exemption, which is now up to 1.25 million. So 10 versus 1.25 is just in freaking order of magnitude. It's enormous. And there's also a new entrepreneurs incentive, which we're not going to get into. It's more limited. But the point here is this is the single biggest shot at liquidating your shares in a tax efficient way that any business owner will ever have access to. Now, one thing to be clear on, though, this is per company, correct? Not per share owner.
Yeah, it differs from the lifetime capital gains exemption in that way, where it is only available for each company, $10 million is available to be split among shareholders in whichever way the shareholders see fit. But $10 million is available per company, correct? Yeah, it is also available, as far as we can tell, in addition to the lifetime capital gains exemption. If your company has been set up with one or more lifetime capital gains exemptions, this is in addition to that. So you can take advantage of both.
So great. So I've got my 1.125. So I really effectively am the sole owner. Now I've got 11.25 million. And then if I was the founder of the business within a certain industry, then the other incentive kicks in, which can make the number even bigger. So it's a very big number, and it's a multi-million-dollar savings. Fantastic. Okay, this is all great news for anyone looking to sell their business. And of course, you can only get that 10 million through the employee ownership trust. So there's one of your incentives for why you would put up with a vendor take back. And
for sure. And maybe I just step back and talk about why they did this, because that is, as you say, a big number. It is actually a smaller incentive than exists in either the US or the UK. And the reason governments have been so supportive of sales to employee ownership is because of the benefits to the country of these programs. And what's been proven in the US and in the UK is sales to employee ownership trusts tend to lead to more resilient companies. They tend to create more jobs. They perform better in recessions. They default on their debt less often. They keep their companies owned within their countries, right? So in the UK, it keeps companies UK owned, and in the US owned, and here will keep companies Canadian owned. And of course, they have all these amazing wealth benefits for workers. So for governments, there are amazing outcomes to be gained from this, and that's why they have been so supportive. And they understand that if I'm a business owner and I'm doing this thing, by virtue of the vendor take back, I am introducing a bunch of risk, and I'm introducing obviously a delay in when I get paid as the owner. So I am making a sacrifice in order to do this thing that I know will be of great benefit to my workers and to my community. I'm doing it because I want to, but this tax incentive levels the playing field for me as the owner, almost. It's still, I think, probably still harder, but it levels the playing field for me versus my other sale options.
So it's interesting because the same line of reasoning, first off, the behavior makes sense. They have skin in the game and they're aligned with the mission of what the company's trying to do.
Yes.
And they depend on it. They're going to depend on it for both their livelihoods, but also their savings now. Right. Yes. So that's huge. And it's interesting because it's an interesting contrast to the agency problem experienced with executives in publicly traded corporations, right? Because the thinking is, okay, we have to incentivize these people with stock options to make sure the stock performs and all that other stuff. But in the end, the agency problem is, are they working for themselves or are they working for the share owners, right? Now you're trying to align those things, but that can lead to not necessarily a fully aligned outcome. Whereas in this case, the share owners are the people making the decisions and the ones showing today every day to work and making decisions to not waste time and not waste resources because it benefits them. So it gets everybody legitimately aligned around. So it's not surprising that, to me, that the resilience numbers or the data is there to support this, given the saying in behavioral communities is that incentives are the most powerful force in the universe. And you've aligned them, guess what? Got to be a good outcome.
What I love about this one, this is my favorite stat, Jason, from this industry in the US, is that in recessions, majority employee-owned companies in the US fire way fewer people in recessions and are also much stronger coming out of recession. So they dramatically outperform their peers in terms of growth and profitability coming out of a recession. And the incentives are super clear as to why that happens, right? If you're a majority employee-owned company, your fiduciary responsibility is to your employees who are the shareholders. In a troubled time, if you can lower your profit margins for the period of that recession and keep people employed, not only are you doing the right thing by your shareholders, but you are going to be stronger coming out of the recession. So it's a really fascinating finding and something that I think defends this as an idea in terms of economic resilience and better for communities and better for workers.
Yeah. And for those who maybe have an issue with the idea of a business owner reaping $10 million tax-free, again, there are other options were to basically not to sell to employees and have these net positive effects on the community, the people they employed and everything else. Yes, it is fair to incentivize them to do something that has a better long-term outcome for a larger community at whole, as opposed to a smaller set of investors.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically we have these incentives now. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, is the capital gains reserve still available for the extended period of time, or did they take that back?
The 10-year capital gains reserve. So they've extended the capital gains reserve for this.
Yeah, so basically what that means, just to clarify for everybody, is that if you were a business owner and you sell your business or you sell over anything, you sell a building, you sell anything that's got a capital gain, and you don't receive payment up front for all of it, you can actually spread out the gain up to 5 years or the amount. So every year you have to realize 20% or the amount you receive, whichever is greater. And that lets you pay the capital gains as you receive the money. Now, the extended timeline here is 10 years, which means that now if I'm lucky enough to sell my business and basically net more than let's call it over 11 to 12 to 13 million, right? Let's just say I sold it for $20 million, okay? First off, I'm going to be happy. Secondly, the second piece is that, yes, I will have tax to pay every year, but I will only pay 1/10 of that tax bill or whatever amount I received that year.
Yeah.
Every year going forward for the next 10 years, allowing me to defer and spread out the tax bill to match when I receive the money. So another great incentive, which on its own was not enough to make this happen, but in conjunction with the 10 million is definitely enough to make us want to do something like this.
That's exactly right. And look, I think it's important to say that, like, in the UK, it doesn't matter how big the company is, there is no tax. So if I sell $100 million to an EOT in the UK, I pay no tax. And the fascinating thing about that is every single British political party is supportive of this legislation because of the outcomes.
Well,
right?
So right? When you see the data, how could you not be? It's incredible.
That's it. And so here again, it has support across the spectrum. It's an idea whose time has come. We have a crisis of succession here in Canada. It is hopefully just in time to be able to take some of those companies that would otherwise have sold places that will not benefit the country, will now be sold to their workers.
Absolutely. Okay, let's talk about the mechanics of this from the employee standpoint. Okay, I go to work for a company that has all these employee ownership trusts. Like, how is my share established?
Yeah. Okay, so it's the Canadian version is actually really flexible, and so the owner, the trustee, these decisions can be made as to how benefits are allocated, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The simplest way as you benefit as a worker is if the company is set up as a profit sharing trust. And what that means is every year the company has a certain amount of additional cash flow. Whatever cash flow is left is just divided amongst the employees by a formula. And the formula can either take into account your wages, the length of service you've had at the company, or the hours you worked, or a combination of all those three things. So in the example of a company where there's $10 million in labor costs and I make $100,000, I will get 1% of whatever the cash flow is available at the end of the day for that company. So that's the kind of profit sharing benefit. If the company were to be sold, right? So if the trustee who governs the company has decided they have received an amazing offer for this company and they cannot possibly reject it, I will get a portion of the proceeds of that sale, again, according to a formula that's been determined by those three things. I think it'll be common for annual profit sharing to be divided based on wages. And if there happens to be the sale of a company, for it to be divided based on a combination of wages and the time you spent there. So if you've been an employee for 30 years, even at a relatively low level, I would think the formula will be set up so that you'll be very well compensated if the company happens to be sold. There is also the ability. Yeah.
I think that makes sense. I think the wages for income is a good argument for that, because if not perfect, but let's just say that basically effectively wages are a measure or metric of contribution to the firm's outcome, which you can say that in some cases they are, in some cases they're not, then that is a relatively good breakdown methodology. Whereas when it comes to sale, then the tenure and contribution over the life of the company absolutely should have relevance.
Yeah, there's a loyalty benefit, or one could see people deciding that there'd be a loyalty benefit. And you could do, in the US and the UK, there's all sorts of formulas and people can make up their minds based on what's right for their company. The other thing that we can do in Canada that you can't do in the UK is allocate share benefits. So me as an employee, I can start to accumulate shares in the company through the trust. And so the owner, the trustee can decide, we're going to pay out some profit sharing. We are going to also allocate some shares so that people feel like when they when they leave the company, they can actually sell their shares back to the company and receive some sort of payment when they leave. So there's all sorts of different ways in which this structure can be set up. And the way you do it will depend on the company and its particular situation, which is very exciting, right? It really provides a ton of different options for different companies looking to do this. A manufacturing company in Lethbridge may have a very different profit profile, may have a very different asset profile than a food distributor in Moncton. So all of these factors can be put into play when you think about how the formula works. The one other thing I will say is in the event of the sale of a company, there's actually a vote that gets transferred to the employees. So the employees have a couple of important rights.
Okay. Yeah, let's go with this.
First, a third of so a trustee board can be any size, right? And the trustee board governs the trust. Then there's a board of directors that governs the company, but there's a trustee board that governs the trust. So they make decisions on how benefits are allocated. They make decisions on whether to accept a sale for the company. They make decisions on appointing board of directors. And a third of that trustee board needs to be employees. So if you have a 3-person board, one of them needs to be an employee. If you have a 5-person board, 2 of them needs to be an employee. It can be more than a third, but it has to be at least a third. So that's an important right for the employees in these structures. The second important right is if they're ever to be considered a sale, a vote will happen by the employees on that sale, right? And simple majority rules. So if there are 100 people at the company and 100 of them vote, 51 of them need to say, yes, it's time for us to sell the company. We understand the benefits we'll receive. We understand what we're giving up, and we will make that decision. So there's some interesting benefits or rights for workers in these structures.
Okay. So basically, we've gone over that. What else should people know about this from the owner standpoint or from the shareholder standpoint or employees shareholder standpoint?
There's a few things that's worth knowing in terms of qualification as far as business owners go. So do I qualify for this tax incentive? So the tax incentive has some qualifications that are important. First of all, and I'm going to try to get as many of them as I can. Jason, I'm sure I'm going to miss some.
By all means, go for it.
The sale needs to be at least 51% of the company. So a majority of the company needs to be sold to the trust. The tax incentive is available only to people who have at one point worked at the company, right? So if you're a passive investor and you've never worked in the company, you don't have access to the tax incentive. It's designed for people who have grown and managed companies. So as long as you've worked for at least 2 years at the company, you have access as an owner to the tax incentive, or your spouse has access. One of the things that they were worried about in design, and they got a lot of things right when it came to this design, which I'm very grateful for. One of them is you envision a scenario where someone owns a company and then dies, right? And now the spouse owns the company. They have made sure that spouse will have access to that tax incentive. The tax incentive is available to most companies, but not certain professional companies, right? The government has excluded 7. There's a set of 7, and you probably know this list off the top of your head. There's a set of
professional corporations, for example, cannot be done, which makes perfect sense.
And only certain kinds. For example, and where I want to make sure there isn't any confusion is a lot of engineering companies are professional corporations. A lot of architecture firms are they're not part of this. No. It's doctors, veterinarians, chiropractors, lawyers, accountants, and a couple others, but it's a very narrow set that are excluded. And as you say, there is some logic to it because those professionals need to be the owner from a regulatory perspective anyway. Most regulatory bodies require that and would have trouble with a trust.
Yeah, and in fairness, professional corporations are largely permitted in most cases as tax planning vehicles more than anything else. Some cases they were liability limiting vehicles, but more for the most part tax planning vehicles. So the incentive was never the purpose was never to permit them to scale a large operation. However, there are in some of those cases we mentioned, there are companies that can actually qualify that are in those fields, just not professional corporations.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And the only other one that I think is worth mentioning is that you have to be an individual to qualify. So companies don't qualify.
Yeah, same basic principles, lifetime capital gains exemption. And when you missed that, go back and listen to that episode. But at the end of the day, only an individual can claim these exemptions, not a holding company.
Yeah, I've listed a bunch of constraints, which then make people think, oh my God, this is complicated. It's really not. Right?
No, it's the vast majority of companies.
Vast majority. You own a manufacturing company in Lethbridge. You're an individual who has worked at the company. You are going to qualify for this tax incentive.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go over a couple of points we haven't gone over yet. So one of the things I think we didn't discuss was I'm an employee who's worked there for 15, 20 years. I go to leave the company to retire. What happens?
It depends on how it's set up. So if it's set up as a profit sharing trust and the company is not sold and you decide to leave, then you leave the company, During the time in which you've worked there while the trust has existed, you've probably got paid extra, a bonus every year, but you get nothing. Yep. If it's set up with a share allocation structure where instead of profit sharing, we as the trust will allocate shares to you, and then we'll track the shares. When you leave the company, you may be able to sell those shares back to the company, which will have kept some cash, and so you'll have a kind of a bonus when you leave the company, as opposed to bonuses along the way. My guess is most of these will be set up as profit sharing trusts in Canada, with perhaps some people using additional benefit for shares. But yeah, so it will depend a little bit on how the trust is set up.
Any reason why you think that, out of curiosity?
I think from a simplicity perspective, right? I think it's just easier. I think as a business owner looking to do this, once you start into share allocation into the structure, it just gets a little bit more complicated.
Fair enough.
I think some people will definitely do it, but I do think most will end up being profit sharing.
I think the incentive from my standpoint is simply looking at looking at it as well. If someone works there for 20 years and then 2 years later the place gets sold, they didn't participate in that. Does that seem fair?
So the government has done another good thing here. They have allowed you to include former employees as beneficiaries, which is not available in the US and it's not available in the UK.
Yeah. So that makes it for a very easy exercise then to basically not have to worry about do the profit sharing one and then have this back door that basically you can include anyone who worked there and recognize them as part of it, which is fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's really well thought through. I think it wasn't an easy road to get here, as we talked about this last year. But the end result's pretty good, and I think will be a model for the world as more countries adopt programs like this.
Just got to get rid of the cap and make it unlimited. But I say that as someone who basically doesn't want that for their clients, especially his own business. But the reality is that if this is having the net social impact we're talking about, and if someone's legitimately selling a business for north of $10 million of profit, that business is substantial and probably employs a lot of people. And that with the exception of, and there's not in software industries really don't do this from what I've seen. But from that very simple correlation of the bigger the gain, likely the more employees means that likely the more people are going to benefit, which it's just a net positive in the end. And whether that was concentrated in the hands of one person or 5 people, it's the end result we really want to get over there. So if we got to reward the one person who created it, so be it, in my mind
Yeah,
at least.
look, and we're hopeful. The story in the US has been continually improving incentives over the years.
Yep.
Right? It's existed for 50 years, and it just gets better and better in terms of the incentives to do it because of its outcomes. Of course, we hope the same thing will happen here in Canada. And look, what we haven't talked about yet is that this thing is time limited as it stands. So the tax incentive
Yeah, that's the other thing.
but it's set to expire at the end of 2026.
Why do you think that is? I got my own theory.
Why don't you go with your theory?
It is a dip in the water to look for future issues and not commit to it until they've had time to test it and see what the actual net impact is.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that. I think the other thing that is probably true is it makes the number smaller for the budget today, because the budgeting is done on a 5-year time period. This is 3 years means you're only capturing 3 years of the potential cost. I think both of those are true, and both of those are not unreasonable. We are of a strong belief that it will be extended. As I say, it has support across all Canadian political parties.
It'd be hard to take this back, quite honestly, unless there was something really detrimental.
That's it. And that's why these conversations are so important, right? We need people to know it exists. We need people to know it's doable. We need people to know it's real. And then we need advisors to ensure that people do it well. So these are good, viable, thoughtful transactions where the employees then succeed with the company after the sale.
Yeah, let's just high level this again as to the net benefits before we finish up.
Yeah.
And by the way, I want to also take the time to thank you for your advocacy on this, because I legitimately think something wonderful has been done for the country here in this regard, and I hope it continues on. And one other statement before we go on, we're not really used to things expiring in this country. The Americans are very familiar with this in the concept of sunsetting. So I think it's not without its merit that it was given a limited time. So let's see how the net impact and hopefully prove that they should do something bigger in 5 years. And I think really that's the incentive, is not just extending it, but let's actually take a look at this and, oh boy, did this work out? All right, this worked out pretty well. Maybe we should run with this, as I think where we hope we want to land on. So let's sum it up again. So employer, if you were to high level the net benefits in a couple bullet points.
Yeah, so for the employee, for an employer, you are getting all of the legacy benefits that folks in the US and the UK get. You are keeping your jobs in your community. You're doing something amazing for your employees. You are ensuring that the legacy of your company continues on after you have left it. There is a $10 million capital gains tax incentive available to you when you sell, plus some additional benefits around the timing of taxes versus when you get paid. And then you also get to stay connected to the company. Some people want a clean break, but a lot of people don't. A lot of people want to stay connected to their company, involved. You can stay on the board of directors. You can stay on the board of trustees. You can help guide the company going forward as these benefits accrue to all of these people who have helped you create the great company that you're selling. So a ton of benefits for a selling owner.
Excellent. And yeah, let's working through the math, just to be clear. 10 million from this incentive on top of your 1.25 lifetime capital gains exemption. And also, we didn't talk about this. Lifetime capital gains exemption and other exemptions are subject to alternative minimum tax, meaning that you could pay some tax, but you'll get it back later over time. The 10 million is not, which means it is legitimately 10 million tax-free, no clawback, no things coming later, anything like that. So that's big. So, but bottom line is the opportunity to, if you qualify for all 3 benefits north of $13 million tax-free, and again, and anything beyond that, the ability to spread that tax bill out over 10 years. So yeah, you might have to be the bank in this instance, but at the end of the day, you're not going to get that anywhere else. And for those, and I hear this all the time, why would I do that? I just take the profit for 10 years. The profit is coming out in form of dividends and you're paying tax on that. So guess what? You were losing 40 some odd percent of that, if not more. You were getting half. So this is effectively doubling what you're taking out over that period of time as an exchange for releasing the shares. So yeah, not bad. And now the employee, the benefits.
So the employee, they don't pay anything for their shares. Because it's debt financed, it means you don't have to pay for your shares. So you as a worker will get benefit just by virtue of being a worker at that company. You're likely going to get additional profit sharing, probably after the debt's paid off. But once the debt's paid off, there will be additional cash flow to be paid out to workers. And then if the company were to be sold, the proceeds of that sale flow to the workers and not to anyone else. So all of the financial benefits of the company going forward go to workers. Plus, you have some now voice in governance of the company through the board of trustees. And again, in case of a sale. The thing you don't have to do, which scares a lot of people, is you don't have to run the company now. If you had a job before, you have the same job now, right? The folks who ran the company still run the company. So you don't have to worry about the company then becoming a very different place to work in. I mean, maybe it will, but you don't have to worry about that. In theory, the governance structure should stay exactly as it did before. And that's one of the virtues of these indirect trust-based ownership structures.
Excellent. Perfect. Jon, thank you so much for your time and thank you so much for your advocacy. This has been wonderful.
No, hey, thanks, Jason. Look, there's a fire under us right now, right? This thing is we are now, how do we make people aware of this? And we're now working on an awareness campaign. We are working on helping to support an association that will back these companies going forward. So we're incredibly excited about the opportunity ahead for Canada here. And anyone who wants to reach out and chat about this, I'm always available.
And where can people find you?
I'm usually available. LinkedIn is a reasonably good place to find me, although I wouldn't follow me because you probably won't like what I say. But you can also reach me at john@socialcapitalpartners.ca. We don't provide any services on this, but I am a useful place to go to find the right person to talk to if you want to talk to a professional about employee ownership trusts.
Excellent. Jon, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Jason. Appreciate it.
If you enjoyed that podcast and would like to learn more about employee ownership trust, please reach out to Jon at Social Capital Partners. Otherwise, as always, if you enjoyed this podcast, please review on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, take care.
This podcast was brought to you by Woodgate Financial, an award-winning financial planning firm catering to high net worth individuals, business owners, and their families. To learn more, go to woodgate.com. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify, or find more episodes at jasonpereira.ca. You can even ask Siri, Alexa, or Google Home to subscribe for you.